Welcome to the Narrator Roundtable. I'm André. Today, we're recording a special live session looking back on our first 10 episodes and picking out some fresh perspectives on everything we've discussed. So, it begins in January 2024. 5 minisodes to get to know a quirky bunch of narrators who dreamed of having great conversations. From the launch of our first conversation with Joel Frumpkin, we knew we'd hit a formula that we loved. The Narrator Roundtable team kept saying, "It's The View, but it's a podcast about audiobooks." And eventually the idea stuck. And conversations that resonated with narrators, guest hosts with fresh perspectives, topics that felt like they're isolated to private Facebook groups and chats all the time. We were really ready to talk about everything and bring all those conversations out into the world. And the surprising part was when the community showed up after we put out the episodes. Hundreds of narrators, authors, even listeners who were connecting with our conversations. And I feel like we learned so much on the fly just producing our first few episodes and coming together as a team. After Joel Frumpkin, we had Daniela Acitelli, Kat Luttrell, Deepti Gupta, Jeremy Carlisle Parker, Jennifer Blum, Jillian Williams, Hillary Huber and Dara Brown, Eunice Wong, and Helen Laser. And there was something exciting about sitting down and saying, let's have the conversations we're in love with and the ones we're afraid of. Let's explore some of the things that make us feel vulnerable as narrators and that make us shine in this work. 10 episodes, 5 minisodes, almost 13 hours of the Narrator Roundtable later, all edited by Kirt Graves. Thank you, Kirt. And I'm just so excited to hear what's new and what's next. And so as we introduce today's hosts, I want to hear what's a surprising thing for you that came out of the Narrator Roundtable. So from our core hosts, we've got Kirt. Hey, Kirt.
Hi, André. Oh, so I have to say what's surprised me?
What's a surprising thing for you that came out of the Narrator Roundtable?
I think just the engagement from people. You and Gail have you've handled our social media very ably, and I was sort of ignoring it. And then you were like, hey, look at this post where we asked a question and a whole bunch of people responded. And I was like, oh God, people are listening and engaging. And that's the coolest thing. That's the best you can hope for when you're creating something like this.
I love it. We've also got Lindsey. Hello, Lindsey.
Hey, y'all. I'm so excited for this live episode. Something that was surprising for me, similar to Kirt, I figured I was excited to work on the podcast because I love having these discussions, but I was like, well, the narrator community is only so big. And then who out of that community is going to be interested? Are we going to be doing a podcast for 5 people? Which, we'll do a podcast for 5 people and still have a good time. But it's been really cool to see how many, and to learn how many folks are also having these same fears or worries or curiosity of the industry or hope for the industry to go in one way or another. It's been really cool to be oh, I thought it was just me and 5 other people, but there's a lot of people out there having these conversations in different places. So that was really cool to learn and to see.
Yeah. Right before we started, Mark was telling us that he'd listen to an episode while he's running on the treadmill and be like, yeah, oh my God. And I've heard so many similar stories of and even being in the conversations, just the resonating, the feeling oh my God, it's not just me who's feeling this or thinking this. We've also got Deanna. Hey, girl.
Hey. I agree that people wanted to be a guest host and more people want to be a guest host. And then a lot of people having solidarity in what we were talking about, but also the flow of the conversations and how there's all these other things that are almost the exact same situation for so many of us where we're already starting to branch out, with other, we have to talk about this because this episode is not about that. Do you know what I mean? Just that free flow that actually really surprised me. And it's been great. It's been a really, really great surprise.
I love it. I'm so excited. This has been such a fun journey, and I can't wait for our next run of episodes. Nothing too exciting to say just yet. I have to hold off. Be patient, André. It's all gonna arrive in due time. But today, what we're doing with this special live episode is studio audience is clapping in the background. We are going to look back on our first 10 episodes, and I really want to hear from the folks who were not present for each of those episodes, just to get a little sense of like, what do you want to throw into the conversation? What do you want to add? What did you see from the outside as you were watching? But additionally, we also have another layer to this. For those of you with your ear to the lore, you'll remember that this all started in a pilot episode of a potential podcast for the Professional Audiobook Narrators Association Diversity and Equity team way back in 2022, which is too long ago. That is a percentage of my lifetime. And we had narrator Mark Sanderlin, we had author Sean David Hutchinson, and we had producer Almeda Bainan coming together to have a kind of cool conversation about a specific book that we'd all worked together on. And in that episode, we got to hear so much from Mark and where he positioned himself. And I thought it would be really exciting to have Mark come back and just kind of tell us a little bit about how his career has shifted in 2 years. So hello, Mark. Welcome back.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me on again.
We're so excited.
This is like a bucket list thing happening right now because this podcast has truly become one of my favorite podcasts. So this is like a fun dream I'm getting to live right now, being like on one of my favorite shows.
Oh, that makes me so happy.
And it's such a delight to listen to you all every week, particularly because I've gotten to work with all of you at this point. Deanna was the last on my checklist, and we just did a multicast together. So I have now like checked the box with everybody on this podcast. So
God.
Very exciting.
I love it. And so I actually want to start with you, Mark, and just hearing a little bit like about your world and your journey. We were able to, through PANA, have that pilot episode released. And so for anyone who hasn't heard it and is curious, you can find it through the PANA website. It's also linked on our Instagram. But in that episode, you were telling us a bit about like what you were focusing on as a narrator, things you were asking producers for. And a lot of it was queer content. A lot of it was like middle grade. And I remember when we talked about the Narrator Roundtable coming to, you were like, oh, things have changed for me. And so I'm just like, what's the update? Like, what's the 411?
Yeah, so I did the math actually earlier today, and I think I've done somewhere in the neighborhood of about 75 to 80 audiobooks in the intervening decades since 2022. So a lot. I think I've learned a lot in that amount of time. I remember we were talking in that episode, there was a question about typecasting and being worried, especially because it was in the context of DEI. And so it was about, I was sort of giving a perspective on pitching yourself to producers as like, I would really love to do more LGBT content and middle grade YA stuff. And at the time, I was really not at all worried about being typecast. In the intervening years, I will say, I leaned really hard into that, and it turned out to be incredibly fruitful for me and has continued to be. And I've gotten to do some really amazing titles and work with some awesome narrators and some amazing authors on books that I really said like, hey, I want to do this. And they gave it to me. But there is a danger in sometimes getting what you ask for. I didn't necessarily expect that it would become no, I did. I was branding myself this way, but I sound very young. For those of you listening to this after on just an audio format, I am in fact a 35-year-old man. So, and it doesn't always come across that way in audio, which is an amazing thing because not everybody, not especially grown men, not everybody is able to like live in this very high tenory space that I am. And so there is a specific kind of book that I am like really right for. And I adore those books. I think some of the best writing is happening in middle grade right now. And it's wild. I did a book a couple weeks ago where I was like, oh, this just summarized 2 years of therapy for me. Cool. However, there are producers that I was really gunning for at that time and really hitting that, like, I want to do queer YA, I want to do middle grade, I'm perfect for this stuff, that now it's become like, oh, I've been doing this for a while now, and those are the only books that they ever consider me for. And, you know, again, I love them, but there are some themes and subject matters and stuff that I would love to explore in this work that reflect more of my own lived experience as an adult. So that's been a new kind of journey for me, going, okay, well, now I've got the ball rolling on some of these things, and I'm a known entity to a lot of these publishers. How do I now start saying, hey, but I'm also good at this thing? And I know that you wouldn't necessarily always hear me doing this, but like, could I throw my hat in the ring for this? Because I am a person who exists in the world. Therefore, like, my voice reading certain material that the audience might not be used to hearing that voice read is valid.
I like that. I feel like this back and forth feels like it is such a crux for so many different kinds of narrators, of like, I want to tell the stories that represent me. And then also like, I can tell more stories than just the stories that represent me. Yeah. And it's been so interesting, I think, to see how everyone navigates this. This for me has been something that, like, every year I go in and I like do the statistics of like, how many Black books did I get? Or like, how many Black authors was I sent? And I mean, we've had conversations about this on the podcast. We don't have an answer, so I don't have a summary to give out to one. But it's really been fascinating, I think, watching everybody navigate that. I'm curious, like, is there something that you would say right now that's kind of your dream, your goal, your North Star to be oh so corporate as a narrator?
Yes, and I have a couple things I want to say about this. So one is there's a great trend in publishing happening right now with new adult as a genre, and I think that has been such a godsend for me because I can authentically play young 20s, mid-20s, and they're exploring cool themes in that still have that kind of voicey YA thing that I do well and I really enjoy doing. So I want to do more of that. And I'm telling people at every juncture that I want to do more of that. I'm finding the way to come in the sort of side door with getting different projects. And one of those is meeting new producers and introducing myself in different ways. Saying like, hey, I'm an experienced narrator. I can do a lot of things. Here's stuff I'm good at, but here's some other stuff that I would also like to do. But one of the ways is through multicasts and saying to producers, and some of this has just happened very recently, where I go, hey, and I actually just finished up recording an animation demo, and I'm going to start using this as a way to pitch this, is to say like, hi, when you're doing multicasts, I am also available to do wacky drop-in character voices as a way to say, hello, I do other things other than the stuff that you know me for, and maybe sometimes that's going to be like a goblin with a lisp, but like just to get them thinking about me in new ways.
I love that.
I think I'm going to continue to keep also pushing into and auditioning when it's appropriate for romance, horror, literary fiction. You know, some of these things where it is traditionally a deep male voice that the audience expects, because again, I exist, and like, I would like to also tell those stories. I have to shout out Kirt here, and I'll try not to get emotional when I do it. But Kirt recently, this last year, brought me in on a fabulous romance book, and it was such a joy to be seen by a colleague in that way. And Kirt and I haven't worked together a ton, but it's been like a really cool collaboration between us and with that author. And that role was so perfect for me, and it was absolutely filthy romance. But
that depends on how much you've done.
Well, yeah. It wasn't vampires and werewolves.
Trust me.
My pseudo's been doing a lot of like fae romance this year, so I'm aware. But it was
there wasn't
also
nearly enough nodding.
Exactly.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I mean, were we going to get through a live episode?
Yes.
K-N-O-T. Oh boy. But that book in particular has sort of opened up a wider world for me where there are romance listeners and romance authors who are aware of that book now and are going, oh, right, that's a story that's not being told in what we are writing right now or what we're listening to. And this was great. And of course, this character has a place in there. So I just shout out to Kirt for recognizing like, oh, right, this person usually does this, but you're perfect here.
Well, and shout out to that author who is also a gay man who wrote a character that when I read it, I was like, well, this sounds like Mark.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't being written like the Henry Cavill in The Witcher, like every other.
What do you mean? I play that all the time.
Well, I don't. So it was like, the voice in my head is Mark's voice.
Yeah.
Like, I wonder if he'll do this.
So we're going to get more of Mark's voice. And Mark, as we cycle through the topics, like I said, we're going to talk to each of the hosts who weren't in each episode, but you're married right in with them. So like chime in wherever something comes up, like we're going to be hearing from you all throughout. But yay. So what I'm going to do is turn to the hosts who were not present for each episode and just kind of hear what came up for them when they heard like how we chewed into that topic. And so I can't wait to pick up some fresh perspectives. And we're going to start with my girl, Lindsey Dorcus. Episode 1, playing your part Identity and Casting with guest host Joel Frumpkin. I'm sure he'll enjoy that one.
Guest host Joel Frumpkin, who we hold in our hearts.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, that was... it was a wonderful episode. Listening to it, I was simultaneously like glad I wasn't there because I got to hear all of your perspectives later and like just be a listener and enjoy it. But also I was sad I wasn't there because I was like, oh man, I would love to jump into this conversation. It was so rich and layered and really lovely. I especially loved hearing everyone's perspective on the idea that I think is incredibly valid and important, that if you belong to a group that is not part of the dominant social group, whether that's like white people or straight people or that you then that sort of like that casting only sort of goes one way. It doesn't go both ways, right? Because it's like I know a lot about what it looks like to be straight because I was acting straight for so much of my life. And that's sort of like the dominant narrative that you see and that you understand, that you absorb narratively. So it's like I can go that direction, but it's harder for somebody who maybe doesn't have as much insight into the queer community because that's not like the default. You have to work to learn about this other community and this other sort of like what the world looks like to somebody like that. It's harder to go in reverse. And so it was really interesting hearing you all talk about that. It really resonated with me. And it's interesting because I think we're seeing this sort of like you see with any sort of movement like this, where these fits and starts of like the books are slowly getting more diverse, but not as fast as one would like, or at least as fast as I would like. It's certainly so much better than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. Which is why I enjoy doing books that resonate with me personally, because I'm like, man, I wish I had this book 20 years ago when I was a younger person. And like, I wish I had more of these narratives and stories and examples to like inspire me or show me like, oh, wait, you can do that? Life could look like that? Hang on. But as publishing sort of like in its little shuffling steps slowly expands, I think it's also like, as narrators, because our work is dependent on what is being published, we sort of have to follow behind, like we have to be even one step behind them as that happens. So it's a tricky dance to try to be like, this is determining the kind of stories we get to tell. And then we need to figure out, casting people and narrators and whoever else needs to figure out like actually who's going to tell them as they come out in their little fits and starts. I don't know. It made me think about that, but I love that episode so much.
Well, and as much as you weren't like, your voice was not in the episode, like you were there because we've talked about those things in depth and so many times that like you've helped to form my thoughts on those things. And I think that's such a great representation of like what this podcast is meant to do, which is to take those private conversations and make them public. But like your voice was there because you've helped me think my way through a lot of those tangled ideas, because it's complicated.
It's so complicated, and I love thinking and talking about this stuff. It's interesting too, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it brings us into episode 2, which I feel also was, in its own way, a very interesting conversation that kind of spread and rooted out beyond the podcast. We brought on Daniela to talk about co-narration. And so Deanna, Gail, and Lindsey weren't with us on that episode. So I want to open up the room to y'all about kind of what your connection to the conversation was, what thoughts blossomed for you after you heard that conversation.
What I liked most about it was that there was an open door. There are things going on that everybody knows is going on, or should I say not going on. And, you know, no one's really talking about it. And in a way, it's kind of like not saying anything is like giving power to it. I don't know. But just to have that moment to really commiserate with what my actual feelings are for when a co-narration experience is wonderful and when it's not, you know, because they're both affecting in their own ways, you know, and they inform like the next experience. Like, what are you going to do? You know, it's interesting because what we're doing for most people, what we're doing is a profession. And so it's a profession that is connected to entertainment, but it's not quite entertainment because it's in this bigger box of publishing, which is, you know, a behemoth of its own. And so it's kind of like figuring out how to create your own operating procedures.
Yeah.
Because they don't exist, you know? Now, that's not everyone. There are some people who are past the BS. They get it before it even starts. And they're like, we're going to tell you exactly how we need you to do it. And then that's how you do it. And that's wonderful. But everybody is coming from different places of experience and different ways of work process. And sometimes there's not time, right? Because of production schedule to have a conversation to figure out the best way these 1, 2, 3, 12 people, whatever, can actually work together. And so I don't think we're anywhere close to finding a solution for it, but I think it's important and hopeful that we're actually having open conversations about it now that don't just involve the narrator community. It's starting to involve more individuals from the production process. So I'm enjoying that.
I love it when I come across a producer that has an expectation in the first email that says, you need to connect with your co-narrator. That is the baseline for what you're doing. What you do after that, you know, your mileage may vary on what your co-narrator wants to, like, you know, really dive in on deep character stuff, or it's just like, it's going to be a voice that kind of sounds like, I love it when they set an expectation. I've been kind of going through this lately about meeting the project where it is. And that's a process of figuring out how every publisher and producer works. Because some of them, I have a brain where it's like, I want to do the absolute best work of my life on every book that I'm doing. And the reality is sometimes the publisher doesn't care and the producer doesn't care. They want a good product at the end, but they're not seeing all the wheels and the cogs turning. You know, it's sort of the visual of the duck gliding across the pond while you're like frantically swimming underneath. But the swimming underneath part is where I've started to kind of modulate and say, well, if my co-narrator is not going to be really super down to dive into this and they don't want to have a super collaborative process, I'm going to do great work regardless. and I'll meet them where they're at. That's been a thing that's released a lot of stress for me because I get really wrapped around the axle when I don't get emails back from people, or sometimes it's been frankly downright hostile. Yeah, that's kind of one of the things I've been thinking about recently.
And like meet them where they're at or not. Like I had to get to the point where I was like, I'm going to do my best job whether they want to or not. And if we end up with a final product where people are like, why didn't these two people talk to each other? Well, I know what my answer will be. I tried, but I had to learn to not modulate my performance down.
Yeah.
Just because I was so afraid of like, oh my God, if I do something that's not generic, like then they're going to be like, why are these two things different? It's like, no, I'm going to be true to what's on the page and I'm going to do my thing. And if it ends up sounding weird on the back end, like, then hopefully we can learn from that and do better next time.
Yeah.
I love it. We're going to pivot back to really the star of the night for episode 3, all about accents with Kat Luttrell. And Lindsey, this was another one we didn't have you at, but that was such a fun, energetic conversation. Kat came with so many like incredible perspectives, like so many things I had never thought of in the context of accents. But I'm curious for you, like, did anything resonate? Was there anything that you were left thinking about afterward?
I loved that episode. And I think it's clear now that the first 3 episodes at a time when I was super busy. So I was like, I'll see you all for episode 4. But then I got the gift of like getting to listen to them and enjoy them. I loved listening to Kat's episode. And I always love hearing from dialect coaches like Kat who, and more, a lot of them have this attitude now. I find, probably more than they did however many years ago. But there's like this great sense of nuance in terms of like, I don't know, I remember like learning accents back in college and it was very much like, this is a British accent. This is a Cockney accent. This is an Australian accent. And these are the rules for that accent. And this is how you learn it. And like, that's it. This vowel changes to that. And that's, maybe that was the academic setting too, but she was absolutely correct in that like there's also such a diversity of like what an Australian person sounds like and what an American person sounds like, what a British person sounds like. A lot of diversity there. Like people come from so many different areas and have so many different weird verbal tics that they carry over from one thing to another. That like there's just so much there, which is a gift, I think, too, because I think it also gives you some flexibility because at least this is how I think of it, of like when I have to learn an accent or sort of polish up an accent for a book, I spend a lot of time with it. I, am listening to a lot of different native speakers. I am writing out like what are some of the vowel changes, what are some of the consonant changes, like what's the musicality like? I'm spending time diving into it, maybe even working with a coach if, I've worked with Kat a couple times. For a book I did recently. So I dive in, but then, I think she also spoke about sort of letting go when you're actually narrating the book because frankly, we don't have the luxury that like a lot of like film and theater folks do with accents, where in both of those mediums, you have a much longer time to focus on one and you have much less to say in that accent. Even if you're on stage and you're the lead in a whole play, that's still 3 hours max? It's nowhere near. That's a novella. That's nothing. And so, and usually we don't have any sort of budget for learning an accent. That comes out of our pockets. That comes out of our pay. I need to portion out part of my pay for that project to pay for a coach if I hire one. And we usually don't have a ton of time. So it's nice to be like, okay, I did everything I could with the time and money and resources I had. And now I have to let go and also know that like my approximation of this accent, like somebody talks like that, like somebody sort of, like maybe I don't hit every single thing perfectly, but guess what? That is how somebody sounds in the world. And that's how a real person talks. And, my approximation is actually probably going to hit some weird little window that works. And that doesn't mean you don't obviously give it your all and, really pay attention to where that story is set and what accent is needed to tell that story. But, it's also nice to be like, well, this is what we got. And I'm a person, and I'm going to sound like a person, and some person in the world sounds like this, so I did it.
Some person in the world sounds like this. Tell us. I love it. I love it. Thank you, Lindsey. And I want to jump to episode 4. And actually, Gail was the host who wasn't able to join us for this episode. But like I said, we're letting Gail heal in these trying times, these unprecedented times. When will they be precedented again? So I know this was an episode you listened to, Mark, and an episode you connected with. So I'm really interested to hear. Episode 4 was our episode with Deepti Gupta, and she was talking about awards and social media. And I feel like the buzzword we landed at was being witnessed. That was this kind of like theme that we circled around. But I'm just curious for you, like, what were those like, oh my God, yeah, moments, or like what resonated with you?
So I was listening to that. It was right after the Audis this year, I think. And I was still in LA. So I had just come through experiencing that, having gone to the awards show, not having been nominated for anything this year, which I actually enjoyed more because I just got to have a drink and cheer on everybody else, and it was no stress, and I had a grand time. It was really instructive, where the validation of a nomination or an award is super important to our souls. It almost never really translates in this corner of the industry into like a mountain of work suddenly coming your way. It, for me, when I've not, submitted myself for SOVAS nominations or been a part of a multicast Audie nomination, it's just amounted to something to talk to when I reach out to producers. It hasn't resulted in any sort of like, oh my God, you were nominated for that thing. It's just been, well, great. Now I have something for the next 3 months worth of reach outs to producers that I can point to and be like, hello, I'm cool. Rather than just be like, I am an actor, give me work. I know I told you guys this earlier, but I just will always think about Deepti talking about plumbers.
The plumbers.
The plumbers line just gave me life. Plumbers don't post about every toilet they unclog. Well, I was like, that is the weirdest, most perfect metaphor. It was so good. It was so good.
Incredible. This was an episode. This is the only place I'm going to chime in about this, but this was an episode that was really fascinating for me because we recorded this, I think, in December 2023, right around the time of the SOVAS, and I was going on this personal journey with awards, and I guess I'll share my narrative now, real fast. Audis 2024, I had submitted a handful of titles. There was this kind of whole confusion, and essentially, I spent 2 weeks not sure whether or not I had gotten a nomination, because I had gotten a couple of conflicting messages. And I was like way more anxious about whether or not I had gotten it than I think I should have been. And ultimately, I took this to my therapist. I was like, I feel like this is weighing on me more than it like should for like a healthy human being. And we were talking about like childhood. That's the first thing she asked me. And like, what was recognition and praise like for you in childhood? And I was kind of like coming up blank, like not really able to come up with these moments or ideas. And the next day, completely by chance, I was on the phone with my mom, and she brought up, just without me prompting, how much she had to work when we were little. And kind of, my parents being at work and me and my brother being at home. And that sprawled into a conversation where she acknowledged that, I was born in Brazil, and the culture we come from, you go around to everybody else and you're celebrating your kid to everybody else, but you don't necessarily share that praise with the child themselves. And it was such a moment of like, it was the most explicit experience I've had of like, oh, these things, these moments of anxiety and tension I have, these like, submit this award, or will I get it, won't I get it, am I on the list or not, are literal moments of trying to find validation or recognition or joy for this inner child who was missing kind of that part of it. And so grateful to my mom that we have the kind of relationship where we were able to have that conversation. But that was such a fundamental shift for me. And thankfully it happened before I went to the Audies, and it made being there so much less stressful. I didn't feel defeated and destroyed when I didn't win. It was such a beautiful night of community and just being able to celebrate people. And I still, the photo of the night is the one of Deanna in the audience with like her arm raised up into the sky. Like that was the energy of the night. But so that episode for me really was like kind of like a touch point in this like very personal trajectory and relationship I've had to awards. So it's been really cool to hear everybody kind of talk about what resonated for them too. So speaking of Deanna, for episode 5, we brought in Jeremy Carlisle Parker. And so much of it was about home studio work, about focus. And this is actually, I'm really curious about this for you because not only do you narrate at home, you also do theater work. You're a multi-hyphenate. For people in audio format, I just moved my hair behind my ear. I'm curious, like, did anything resonate for you? Yeah, like, what were your thoughts after that episode?
So, you know,
she got that thesis.
You really can't control the fact that other people have expectations, right? Or make assumptions. So I'm not saying it's easy to do, but it is easier to not take in and put upon yourself things coming from the outside on top of what you may already have existing from the inside coming out. So, I mean, I don't even remember when multitasking became a thing. I do remember being taught that I needed to know how to do it and do it well in order to be successful. And I tell you, the devil is a lie, okay? Because it's shoddy goods. No, I actually had someone, actually just in the last couple of years, try to convince me that I needed to figure out how to work better in the capitalistic framework of America and how that related to audiobooks and my work in it. And I was like, you know how capitalism was built, right? Mm-hmm. Like the White House on the backs of ... So I was like, I'm not your audience. And so I think being able to know yourself, to be definitive in what is the truth for you. And for me, the truth is focus. If I can, I can. If I can, it's going to be amazing. Okay? Or I'm not going to do it. Yeah. So it's really about making sure, for me, the fundamentals are taken care of. You know, am I paying bills? Are there procedures? Am I following them? Is it lawful? You know, the things that are important. and then if I have time, all that other stuff to me is peripheral. And sometimes it's this wonderful icing or like those little Jimmy sprinkle things you put on the top, you know, or they're just the calories. Like they don't matter. Yeah. They're unnecessary. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of what I took from it, because the thing is everybody's coming from these different places, and we have outside forces, like they are entities and structures and laws and, schedules that we can't control that are dictated to us. And then don't even get me started on the people, you know, and as Mark was saying, there are so many people who have different processes of thinking and wanting to work. And it is in your advantage, yes, to make notes and figure out what those things are, because it's going to make your life easier. So I would say the onus on us really is to figure out the safest way to get through and then figure out how to make a living doing that. Because that may be one thing, period, or it may be one thing at a time that literally is a diversification, in your philo file that actually helps you sustain, and maybe thrive instead of just survive, just getting by. But yeah, it is a lot of responsibility to be freelance and to figure it out.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And when in doubt, get a coach. Coaches help. They will save a life.
Save a life. And it's so interesting. My update about this whole journey from last week is I co-worked with someone. I had never done that before. And you know what? That was so effective. And what you just said, Deanna, I need a tattoo across my forehead. Safe. There's something about the way you said that I'm like, I feel like that hasn't been in my lexicon about this conversation yet. We've all seen the can you read English? You can narrate audiobooks for $400. And there's something about where that hustle culture, that entrepreneurism approach to this work meets the reality of a full-time workload. And the real balance there kind of is safety, that we have to be able to identify what keeps us alive, what keeps us alive financially, but what also keeps us alive psychologically. I love that. I appreciate that a lot.
I've been thinking about this so much recently, and this podcast has helped me process so much. It's been amazing. This conversation in particular, I was like, oh, it's not just me. I also can't get myself to do anything in my own booth at home. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm not a bad person. We talked about it. I think there was one book I worked on where they brought me into studio, and I think we passed the 4 finished hour mark.
Wow.
In one day. And I was like, I'm sorry, I don't even feel like I broke a sweat today. Today, this day we're recording, I think maybe I got half an hour done over the course of the entire day because I kept being like, oh, I don't want to do this. Oh, God. Let me just go check Twitter for a minute. But I want to tie this to what Deanna was talking about, because I'm starting to really hone in on anytime I make a decision from a place of scarcity, it ends up coming back and biting me in the ass. And the problem is, because of the lead time for production for this, I might be saying yes to something in March because I'm looking at the rest of my calendar for the year and going, oh crap, there's nothing on the calendar. Sure, I'll take this book that maybe I don't really want to do, in my heart of hearts, or maybe I'm not quite right for, but crap, I know I'm going to need rent money in June. And then when that comes around, I'm like, why the hell did I do this? Now I'm swamped with work, and I'm beating my head against the desk doing this work that I don't want to do. So I'm really trying to hone in on where are those things that are keeping the lights on and also keeping my soul alive, and finding where those meet and trusting in my business practices to keep the spigot turned on for those. Those 3 things all colliding to make a better work situation, and asking to be brought into studio more often.
You said colliding, and I just saw the Jimmy Neutron brain blast kind of logo going on. So
I told you, I'm trying not to be typecast as a kid anymore.
I'm sorry. I love it. We're at the halfway point, and we've got 5 more episodes to reflect on. We don't have currently a submission for someone to jump in, but we do have punch-ins today. We got punch-in questions.
Excellent.
For anyone who doesn't know, you can always go to our website, drop a question, and for our regular episodes, we bring in those questions into the conversation as punch-ins. So I've got one, if we don't have any submissions coming in through the form right now. The first punch-in question for the hosts here. When you first began working for publishers, did you get any sense of feedback after you completed a book? Did you ever wonder if anyone listened to the entire audiobook and what they thought of it? So many chuckles. give me the essays.
So many chuckles.
I was so hoping to talk about this.
Nope, none.
I mean, listen, I would every once in a while, I do get a little sprinkle of feedback. It's so rare though. It's so rare, but like either from like the proofer being like, "Hey, the publisher being like, "Hey, I'm passing along from the proofer that they really enjoyed your read and like really had a great time." And I think maybe twice from the like casting person producer themselves. But I mean, mostly I assume like if they don't come yell at me and tell me I did it all wrong, that it was good. And if they hire me again, I'm like, then it must have been great. But that's the only feedback I get from publishers.
Yeah.
I find it to be so parallel to acting on stage or in camera. Your feedback from the casting director, i.e. producer, whatever, is that next audition, is them actually emailing you to check your availability. Like, that's your feedback. That's how you know what you're doing is okay. And in saying that, because that is kind of like the baseline and that's like the norm, when someone actually has something to say and they actually say it, or better yet, they put it in writing, what? You are my favorite forever. Whatever you ask me to do, I am available. Right? It just, it elevates it. I will say this, the authors. I actually wasn't expecting that. And the authors are just so lovely. You know, they're so close to this material. Yeah. Given all the time that they spent like with it. And so they're so specific with their feedback. Like there's no better, you know, there's no better honor, trophy, pat on the back than that word from the author when they are extremely happy with what you did. Yeah.
Amen.
Absolutely. I remember meeting JL, who's an author I narrated for. I went to the book launch, which, by the way, narrators, should a publisher pay you to go to a book launch? Absolutely. But if you're around, it's so fun to meet one of your authors. Oh my God. Went to the book launch, met her, and she told me kind of what her thought process was behind the casting decisions of me and my co-narrators. And I was like, I don't know that you know this, but we never hear this. We never, ever hear this. And just like Mark with our interview with Sean David Hutchinson, he got to kind of give us the same kind of insight. And it's funny how radically shifting it is, because sometimes it's like, oh, this thing that I'm bringing into the world, like people are seeing it, people are celebrating it, so exciting. And then sometimes you hear a thing and you're like, oh, maybe you didn't get the book, right? It's like, oh, I did a great job. They even enjoyed it. It just wasn't the right thing. And that's also fine. Like I did nothing wrong when I didn't get the book. So it's been so good to like hear from people and feel that. I love it. We've got another punch-in for after episode 10's review, so stay tuned, everybody. But I want to roll into episode 6, and we had Jen Blom join us, and we kind of talked about everything, because we talked about, like, everyone involved in the production process all the way down the line, and then we landed in AI. Like, that conversation was robust. And so the folks who weren't there were Kirt and Deanna. And I'm curious to hear what kind of stood out to you. Like, are there any skeletons left in your closet about that conversation?
I would just say, like, a production note, like, for people who are wondering, like, I think up until this point, like, episode 6, I think all 6 of those we recorded before we released any episodes.
Yes.
And they were all, like, 2 hours long when they started. So, like, there's a lot hit the cutting room floor. And in this conversation especially, like, it hit so many different areas that, like, a lot had to go. And so Gail, who produced that episode, and I worked together to, like, try to find a theme, but, like, there was a lot there that didn't even make it into the episode. The thing that stuck out to me the most in the conversation about AI, I so appreciate Jen bringing her perspective, and really being a voice for, like, ways that this could possibly be good for people. The part that I wasn't quite all the way convinced is, it still seems to me like, even in a world where you can license your voice and you can let someone use it to do an audiobook and you can still be involved in the process. I guess my thing with that is twofold. One, it's my own imposter syndrome, because I'm sitting here thinking, like, if someone can license Eduardo Ballerini's voice, why would they ever license mine? Like, if that's available, if the big names are available, why are they going to come to a small fish? So, like, I don't know that, like, we have work because they physically can't narrate every book. But if it was just a matter of pressing a button and letting the algorithm do the work, like, wouldn't they just be doing everything, those big name voices? But related to that is also, like, but how do we pave a way for the people behind us? And if we're thinking about allowing AI voices and licensing our voices and doing books that way, I just think, like, who comes behind us? Who fills in the gap when we are done doing this work? If we've set it up so that, you know, technology has taken over the job of a narrator. Like, I still just stand convinced that the only way to move forward is human voices all the time.
Yeah, and it has the potential to essentially, like, remove the bottom rungs from that ladder. And, like, maybe there are still some people who will, like, be able to jump straight to rung 5, but it removes a lot of steps, I think, potentially for, like, people starting out in the industry.
I wonder if there will ever be a term like anti-AI calves, because you can jump that gap. Oh. Deanna, what about you?
I mean, it's hard, right? Because there is no regulation. No one is watching anything. Nobody's responsible for anything. If you kind of look at the way, at least in the US, copyright law works, I think something like that could work for AI, where it's not necessarily creating a market where we're in competition with a computer-generated version of us. Do you know what I mean? Because that's not how copyright law works, you know? So, and then, you know, when things come into the public domain, it's more about using that as source work to create new things. Do you know what I mean? So in that context, I think something might be able to be figured out, but I'm sorry, like, everything I do professionally is acting, has been, like, since I was a kid. So the whole concept of eliminating that, it just doesn't, the existence of that is not human enough for me to be happy with the prospect of it.
Yeah.
A small anecdote about AI, a little bit off of audiobooks, but I don't know how many of you have been watching the new season of The Circle on Netflix, which is a reality show.
Oh my God.
Where, like, people already talk to each other like robots on that show when they're, like, communicating via text messages. It's wild. But it's been interesting because this latest season, one of their gimmicks is, like, one of the players is an AI. And, like, ooh, can any of the other players guess who it might be? And, like, can they tell? And it's like, well, A, it's The Circle. Everyone's talking like robots. Of course they can't tell. But B, I noticed, interestingly, there's a couple shots and a couple, like, funny little things where it's like, ooh, it's talking in a robot voice. Ooh, it's like, it's strategizing. But then, like, as the season goes on, there's very few clips of the AI because it's boring, because it's not entertaining. Like, the entertaining thing is watching all the humans freak out when they learn that someone's an AI and they're like, oh my God, who can I trust? Oh my God, who's a person? And, like, everyone in their little apartments doing their weird little things. The people are fascinating. We watch the show for the people. And I'm sure, and you can tell the people who made the show probably figured out pretty quick in editing, watching a computer be like, I'm pretending to be a human man is, like, boring. It's boring and nobody gives a shit.
Yeah.
So, like, but it's just like every time I feel like I encounter AI in the wild, I'm a little bit reassured by the fact that I'm like, oh, this is incredibly boring. This is nothing. I hate, like, I'm not engaged with this. So anyways, that's my little 2 cents on AI today.
Yeah.
That was.
And for the other part of the episode, really talking about production, it kind of empowered me to not be so precious about asking questions about things that I don't know. I need to just ask the questions so I know what I'm doing and not feel like I'm bothering people.
I like that. Deanna, we're going to stick with you because in episode 7, you were our host who wasn't able to make the episode. And we had Jillian on talking about like finding your own voice. And I loved kind of hearing how that manifested for everyone, all the little journeys that everybody went on. And I'm curious, like, is this a journey you had? Like, what came up for you when you watched that episode?
Okay, so very early on as a vocalist, it was interesting to find being a kid, like 12, having grown ass people with their own kids, like just so opinionated. I'm 12 years old. I'm out here just trying to have a good time, before I started doing anything professionally. And it was kind of good because it turned me away from using my own voice and I became an instrumentalist. I play multiple instruments for people who don't know. I was a band geek, that sort of thing, a drum major. And it wasn't really until I was getting ready to graduate high school that I got some more of that confidence back, because it didn't take me long to identify that there was no way on earth, no matter what happened, that everybody was going to be okay and maybe even happy with what I was doing. So I literally needed to figure out again what was safe and a happy place for me to be as this performer I wanted to be, because I love Debbie Allen and that's why I wanted to be in musicals and dance, sing, and act all at the same time. And I knew that there were going to be people that would just hate it and they wouldn't be into it. But there would always be at least one person in that moment who would be, even if it was me.
I love that.
Even if it was me, because I think I'm hilarious, and other people are like, oh, what is she doing? And I am laughing and having a good time. Ha! So it's one of those things, I think, where, again, if you are able to know what your individual voice is, does it, speaking as a vocalist, is it a gospel feel? Is it jazz? Do you have classical training? And do you have classical training and figure out that that's not where you want to be because classical music isn't a safe place for you? Find like where that is and be okay with doing that. But then again, as Mark was saying, letting people know what that is. Because sometimes I find more enjoyment and longevity in allowing myself to be real in whatever that moment is of that audition, because that was my gut choice. That's like with everything, with training and my lived experience, that's where I was in that moment with that character, with that scene. And if they can't see it and they can't connect to it, guess what? For them, I'm not right for it. And kind of being able to let that go and literally roll and move on to the next thing. That's not an easy thing to do. And that's literally decades of that. Because I used to be a people pleaser, but not so much now, because it, it didn't feel healthy. It felt like it was going to give me an ulcer, actually, because I was more concerned with what other people were concerned with, And I'm just going to say it. I'm going to say it again, and I'm going to keep saying it. If I heard one more time, can you be blacker? Huh? Mm-hmm. I present as nothing else. So what do you mean? And it's your perception of what you think that is because of your lived experience or the fact that you only know Black people from television. You don't know living, breathing Black people because we're everywhere and we sound like everyone. So, yeah, it's kind of one of those things where I think if we can be comfortable and confident enough to share what that reality is for us, and then we find our people, we find that connection of the people who get it, the people who are into it. Because I swear, there's somebody out there. But again, it's on us. It's on us to put it out so that we can find those people and make those connections. That's really what I got from it. I mean, woo, that conversation could have gone on and on.
I
but
know that's right.
You know?
So for episode 8, we had Gail and Kirt who weren't able to make it. And so, Mark, don't forget you can tap in whenever you want. So we had Hillary Huber and Dara Brown join us on the pod, and it was super interesting to see them talk about like what it was like for Dara to jump in the past couple of years, what it was like for Hillary to start in audiobooks like 20 years ago. Or maybe I'll bleep that number out. I don't remember if she admitted that out loud or not. But it was really fascinating to see how much of the industry had changed. And so, yeah, from y'all who weren't in that episode, like, what was the moment when the golden watch hit you in the face?
That was such a good episode.
It was so good.
Fascinating.
What a gut punch. I mean, I'm so grateful to Hillary for coming on and talking about it and being honest, because it's like, you do hope that at some point it gets easier. But no, the work is getting the work. Like, and that is going to be true for the duration of this career. I didn't want that message. I reject it wholeheartedly. But I also need to hear it probably repeated. So I'm glad the podcast exists so I can go back and listen again. But the other thing that I found so fascinating was how many times in that conversation, and also in conversations I've had with other people about how they feel lucky about the time they entered the career, and how that was true for everyone in that conversation except for Dara, who joined a couple of years ago and was like, yeah, actually, I feel like maybe I didn't join at a totally opportune time. And I was like, whoa, that's really saying something, to like be in it and to see that. Yeah,
the Hillary is awesome. And I'd love hearing her speak, as do millions, actually, oddly enough, because she's Hillary Huber. But Kirt, just echoing everything you said, it was really challenging to hear, but also I don't know, it felt a sense of solidarity and like, this is the work, and I struggle with this, and the person at the top of our field struggles with this, and great, this is where we all are. How do we figure it out? And I also, throughout the episodes of this season, I know that many of us worship at the chapel of Andy Arndt here, but having some business coaching sprinkled in when you're paying for dialect coaching and acting coaching and getting into new genres, having those business moments in there has been game-changing for me to go like, oh, right, I am running a business here. Here's how a business person would approach this to keep the hose on for the lean times and know how to anticipate them or deal with them when they happen, or I don't know. I'm still learning how to save money for when they happen. Hasn't happened yet. Yeah, it's just a fascinating episode. And I totally hear, I feel like I got in at both late and yet at the right time, hearing what it's like for somebody coming in now. Because there were people right before when I was in who were getting those, those Audible contracts, those, 15-week contracts where they're just like, we're just going to hire you to do books for 3 months. Don't book anything else. Here you go. And that was this sort of apocryphal thing that was happening. And I'm like, that's never been my experience. Or I never worked with a director until many books in. Many, many, many books in. But that's where we are.
Yeah. I want to actually throw a punch in here about episode 8's conversation from Colleen Arnold to the whole room. And she wants to know, what helped you leap from a beginner/emerging mindset into a confident pro mindset? She says, about 25 books in, not brand new, but still feeling like I haven't jumped that gap just yet.
In a lot of
do I feel confident yet?
Right? That's part of it. Is like, I think I've said this on one of the episodes. Like, I know I can't say baby narrator anymore, but I still feel it. I still feel like there's so much to learn. For me, it was actually the APA's mentor program, and it was you, André, and Jennifer in the DEI committee saying like, you should do this, and me being like, no, not me. And you're like, no, like, do it. And because what it forced me to do was to interact with somebody who was brand new to the industry and realize, oh, I do have something to offer. I do have a perspective and experience. And I do know people that when I don't have the answer, I can find it out. Like, I have built a network and connections. It's like, oh, okay. But like, when you're in it, you just don't see it. So like, the mentoring program really helped. Creating this podcast has really helped. Because it really doesn't matter how many books are under, or like what the number is under, like number of titles you've done. At least for me, it still feels like I just have so much to learn. But I do also have something to offer other people. Always with the caveat of like, this is my experience. Take it or leave it.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think now, thinking back, that was my experience as well with the DEI mentorship program. And feel like, oh, I do have knowledge to impart. You don't know this? Oh, right. That's something you wouldn't know off the top of your head. And then getting to introduce my mentee at APAC that year was like, come on, here you go. I've prepared you. We're going to go meet some producers now. And sort of like, oh, there goes my baby bird.
Yeah.
That was really exciting. And I've felt just actually in the last year and a half or so, that feeling of being in those rooms at the Audis or at APAC or at the mixers and feeling, okay, I know the players here. Who do you want to meet? I can take you around. I'll introduce you to so-and-so. And I'm not an unknown quantity, if that makes sense. That's felt good. But frankly, it's the same thing with that Hillary episode. You know, there are Audie winning narrators who have asked me to introduce them to producers, where I'm like, you don't know them? Really? How's that? But that's just the nature of kind of how we get siloed into the places where we're working.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the landscape keeps shifting, right? Like, in small and big ways, who's doing the hiring, how you get the work, what they're looking for when they're casting an audiobook, even like narration styles are sort of like shifting and changing all the time. So I feel like there's always, in addition to the general learning curve of like always be improving your craft, which applies to everything. There's also a method of like, oh, my contact at that publisher got a new job somewhere else and I don't know who the new person is. And like, oh, hang on, I need to like reestablish this thing. And it's not from scratch because you're still coming in with like how many books under your belt and experience and whatever, but it's still like, oh, okay, well, I gotta again, or I gotta hop back on this, or like, oh, everyone's doing this now. Okay, well, what's that like? There's always something to learn, fortunately or unfortunately.
Absolutely. So I love this just about near consensus. Colleen, it means that you're ready to apply to be a mentor for the APA's DEI mentorship program, if you remember.
That's when you know.
And I think that's when you know. That next quarter is actually June. Is that right, Deanna? Probably about June when the next like DEI mentorship like cycle is going to kick off in June.
Well, we're in one now. So we don't do it over the actual summer because of all the logistical things. But
That's right.
The fall. We'll start again in the fall.
Okay. So we on the committee, so Deanna and I are both on the committee for the DI mentorship. So we can't wait to see your application this fall.
Yes. If you've always thought about it, but didn't think you might be right, guess what? You're probably perfect for someone. So come on down. Put in your application.
Hey, there's a cute little video that Dominique Franceschi did on the website of like, are you considering being a mentor? And you should go watch it. So we're going to keep hearing from Deanna about episode 9. This was such a fun episode, in part because Eunice revealed to us at the end of the recording that she recorded the entire thing sitting like at the foot of her childhood bed in the same way that she would like do homework in high school. And I loved that. Very narrative. But we got to talk to Eunice Wong about craft, about respecting audiobook narrators as actors. And this conversation, like, I emailed Eunice when we as a team, we like threw together this list, like, who do I want to talk to? Eunice was on the list. I reached out to her. I was like, what do you want to talk about? And she was like, at first she was like, give me a week to think about it. And then she came back and she was like, I want to talk about respecting audiobook narrators as actors. Loved what she had to say in this episode. And so, Deanna, you weren't able to join us, and I think it was a technical issue, actually, that you weren't able to join us for. But what kind of, like, what stood out for you when you were hearing that conversation?
I mean, as far as respect, really taking in, no matter what the experience of someone is, because the craft is so interwoven into the actual words of the text, right? It's us as actors in this medium of audio, but delivering words that have already been created from another craft, which is writing. So, I don't know. I just love her. I just love her so much. And that entire episode, I watched it twice. That entire episode, it just literally was facts, speaking truth to light and educating people, in listening, right? Like critical thinking and critical listening. It doesn't mean everything is bad. It's literally listening actively and thinking about, having thoughts and feelings about what you're hearing. So to be able to acknowledge and respect that a human wrote these words, a whole human, to acknowledge and respect that a whole human is delivering this story to you, especially if it's a solo narration. Step off. I'm doing 26 characters. Okay. And then to also realize as the listener that you are part of this experience, this craft, this art, and allowing people to live in it. Now, I would say for most of the listeners I've had the opportunity to meet going to like a different book con or whatever, most of them get it. They actively get it. And they're in awe, actually, if you even do 2 characters consistently and well, because if they are able to take you out of the equation and they're just living the story of like whatever's being laid out or the information you're giving, right? If it's nonfiction, they're like, oh my God, this is so important. I feel like I understand this so much more fully with, how you delivered it. Because nonfiction, sometimes you have to act that stuff too, whatever. And so I feel Eunice could be easily our poster person for exactly what it means to be serious about doing this work. And just because you're being serious about the delivery and the distribution of this work does not mean that it cannot be fun. Sometimes it's more so because of the care that was put into putting it together. And I think just that mutual respect, just understanding that everybody who's involved in that process from production to listener is wanting to support this industry. It's why you're even involved in the process. And so, not to take us in another place, but allowing an opportunity for choices to live in that space and realizing that most people didn't just pull that out of their pocket. Like there's 20 years of study behind how she did that French Canadian accent. Thank you very much. I don't know. I think overall, if people are conscious of the fact that it's not just someone's creativity, more times than not, it's someone's livelihood that's on the line every single time you push play. And then it's multiple people, right? It's the narrator, how many narrators were in the book, and then it's also the author, and then it's also the publishing house, and then the person who put it together, and the person who cast it, and all of these things. So in wanting to be able to have more and to perpetuate and to uplift the industry and allow it to continue growing as it is, I feel coming down fundamentally and allowing yourself to recognize that this is a performance happening. It's not someone just reading line by line, word for word. It's someone who's put thought process and preparation into what they presented to you. Will kind of maybe allow us to have more growth in the diversity of work that everybody is able to do and consume, which will allow us to actually invest more time in actually becoming as authentic as possible in each performance that we do. Y'all, it's cyclic. Okay? It's cyclic.
Circle.
In my opinion.
I love that. Deanna, when's your book coming out?
Right?
I'm ready. I'll be sad. Come on. Oh, I love it. We're rolling into our last episode recollection. We've got a couple punch-ins, someone going to come up on stage to join us shortly. But for episode 10, we had Helen Laser on, and it was Lindsey who wasn't able to join us. But that episode was so every episode for me has had some level of kind of validation or release, that this thing we mentioned of oh my God, I'm not alone. And this one felt big to be able to have this conversation in a public space about booking, about portfolios, about filling your calendar, about negotiation, all these different things. So what stood out for you, Lindsey? What were you left thinking about after watching episode 10?
Oh man, I will say really tough for me personally to listen to. And in fact, when we first announced we're having this conversation about this topic, I was really nervous. And then it turned out that I just couldn't be there that day anyway. Listening back to it, I'm going to give my emotional and not analytical answer here. Listening back to it, I had to pause multiple times and take a break. And and take a walk and listen to something and be because I was having so many big feelings, because talking about all this stuff, it brought up a lot of fear and a lot of and a lot of envy and a lot of other really big feelings for me. Because I also specifically, I've been in a mini drought recently. My January and February were really light. And then I had some life stuff happen in March that screwed up my March. So it's been 3 months now of not full months. They have been 2/3 of what I normally do in a month. Which is fine, but the longer it goes on, the scarier it gets. And so I've sort of been in that place recently of okay. And how do I get out of this? And then it's hard, because then I sort of feel guilty if I get an offer that's lower than what I usually work for, or something that I wish I could bump up. And I know people who I would consider peers are asking for more from these companies. I'm I don't feel safe asking. I'm okay, yes. Okay, thank you. But you guys were talking about, it's a tricky thing balancing, filling out a schedule, balancing out your rates, balancing out your portfolio. Right now, my May is really full, and I'm really grateful for that. I'm finally. But it's also because I said yes to a lot of stuff that I might not have said yes to in a more abundant time. And it's almost, I say, it's almost all pseudonym romance, which can be fun. But I just find when I do a ton of those in a row, I the lack of variety sort of gets to me after a while. And so it's oh, next month is all my, I have one book under my name and the rest is all pseudo work that, again, I'm grateful for. But I'm ooh, if I could have designed this, I would have had a couple pseudo books and a couple Lindsey books and mixed it up a little bit. But at the time I was I need a full month. I need a full month. And I have one, thank God. But I don't know, it's hard. I love and I admire people who are able to talk about this in a more analytical way. I will be the first to say the business part of it really is a struggle for me that I'm constantly working on. And the people who are good at it naturally or through their own work are incredible to me, are magnificent, and I love learning from them. But also ooh, the feelings. There were so many big feelings that came up for me in that episode.
Yeah, absolutely. It was I really want to say it was Kirt who said in a different episode. I feel like it was Kirt that said in the same episode, I asked a question and then there was a pause and he went, André, I feel like you think about this way more than me. I don't have the same kind of mindset about this. And it's enlightening, because I'm also the point of the conversation is to acknowledge that I'm also not a master of this. I have no perfect control over my schedule. And we have these different approaches. We have these different strengths. And this is where I'll end the comment, because I'm also curious. We've talked in the space of social media and this witnessing of buddies and pairing, and I'm curious what that looks like in these other spaces, like things like business, and so that's all. I'm wondering what that means for people to be in collaboration with other narrators about more than just your like need to be validated and seen, but also like the business side, short of coaching, but still fascinated. Just throwing that out into the air.
No, I will say I am so grateful for the friends that I have, the narrator friends that I've gotten closer with, that I trust, people that I feel comfortable reaching out to, and sometimes being like, hey, they offered me this. What range do you usually get from them? Like, and again, it's not in a big public forum. It's not on Facebook. It's not like, hey, everybody in the whole school. But it's like, a couple trusted colleagues just to get the temperature on it and be like, is this low? Is this medium? Is this high? Like, where do you usually live? People I consider peers. Like, where are we? And I know Gail is somebody who is here in spirit and physically, but not sonically.
She's a ghost.
I'm a ghost.
She's not dead. Gail, who is this ghost?
Lives on in our hearts.
But she's always in our hearts, always in our hearts. But Gail is somebody for me who I admire so much as a business person, and who has been like incredible to talk to about negotiating. And so I'm really grateful for friends where I can be like, hey, can I ask for, like, are they going to tar and feather me, or can I ask for a little bit more? And the friends who are like, yeah, and I have, and like, here are some helpful phrases, or here are some ways. And you guys talked about that in the episode with Helen a little bit about like, here are some ways to approach it that feel like, hey, we're both business people. We're both trying to make, the best product, and we're both trying to get paid fairly. Hey, can you meet me closer to this rate? Hey, what's this about? Like ways that don't feel confrontational, but still feel professional to ask for those things. So I'm incredibly grateful for my more business-minded friends who have given me tips and tricks. But it still can be scary. I don't know. When you're in times of like scarcity or drought, it can still feel like you're navigating all this stuff. At least I am. I'm navigating all this stuff in addition to the like cut and dry math of it all. But I'm so grateful. Like, I'm repeating myself, but I'm so grateful for both people that I feel comfortable like talking to one-on-one, and also everyone, Helen and everyone else for talking in that podcast about their approaches, because, and coaches I've paid to talk to me about business stuff. I'm so grateful for the smart people who know that stuff.
For friendship. I love it. So that's our retrospective, our 10-episode reflection. We've got a few things to get us through the finish line, and thank you so much again to all our live guests who are joining us in the audience here today. So we've got a punch-in. We're going to bring someone up on stage, and then we've got a couple announcements before we wrap. So here's the punch-in question. It's another publisher-related question, and it's, after you finished your first few books with publishers, did you think to yourself that you were well prepared for that project, or that you should have recorded a few more books before you stepped into the Big Five arena? This one's open to the room.
I can speak to that a bit. I did a crap load of books before I was working for the publishers. Probably not very well, one would say. And I got freaked out when I initially started recording for them, because I was like, I know that whatever I'm doing in the wrong DAW is not what they probably want. So I ended up paying a coach to like walk me through Reaper and all this kind of stuff. I will say a few books in, I had a producer from Macmillan who hired me on a really tough book, and it was like trigger warnings, paragraphs long. It was really good. But who came in and said, I want to direct you for a bit on this just to make sure. And they said that it was for the content. I do kind of think it was a little bit like, let me just make sure this person knows what they're doing. But I was so grateful for that, because it gave me the confidence on like day 2. He's like, hey, I got some meetings this afternoon. You're killing it. You got this. Carry on. We never get that from producers. And so just to have that stamp of approval from somebody at a Big Five was like, you got this. Yeah, you know what you're doing. Great. Carry on. That was like super helpful. There are a couple of things that have come up in the last couple of years around how people worried about directed sessions when those are happening. People kind of freaking out about, oh God, I've never done this before because I have my own little process that I've figured out in my little cocoon of indie ACX books. And I do think that there might be a space where you could do some more like mock directed sessions with people who have been in those situations to say like, you're crushing it. This is going to be great. Relax. Do the work that you know you can do.
For me, the biggest adjustment was the timeline. Because similar to Mark, I did a ton of indie ACX books, both on ACX and other indie places and direct with authors. I didn't get my first publisher book until like 2021. And by then I'd been doing it for a few years. And I was already full-time. I was able to go full-time just on like indie stuff. But the like quicker turn, like, because with indie stuff, I was able to schedule myself pretty far in advance and give myself a decent amount of wiggle room. And I was used to producing a certain number of hours a week and being okay with that. So then when I started doing publisher books, the thing of like, oh, you just need like a couple days to record this, right? So like, we can give you the manuscript this day and then we'll get it back. We'll get all the files back a week later. And you're like, oh, okay. You know what I mean? I'm used to like plodding along at my little indie pace. And all of a sudden it was like, oh, so it's like this many hours long. That should just take you like 2 days, right? And you're like, okay. So figuring out like, and then also sometimes, you know, communicating back like, actually, I will need an extra day because I'm recording in a home studio and this is how I work. And like, you know, not necessarily saying, oh, well, I guess I have to kill myself to do this book. But yeah, but like trying to get used to their processes and procedures, and also that more like full-time timeline. When I was used to like sort of fitting my audiobook narration in around my day job, being like, oh, now I'm doing this all the time, and so I have to produce way more than I'm used to. But it was a, you know, pretty quickly made adjustment, but that definitely was like the biggest shift for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, having more hands in the processes that I had created was really, it was jarring at first to be like, I'm sorry, you want what? You need this? But that's not how I do it. And it's tough. I think that this is a conversation that sort of pervades a lot of the episodes that you guys have done so far, is the ever-shifting way that people enter the industry and the way that books are produced. There are systems that were in place 10, 15 years ago that kind of don't apply, and most people don't get into audiobooks working for the publishers right away and not working with a director right away. There are many seasoned narrators I know who did their first books with a director who, on the fly, in the session, were basically teaching them how to narrate audiobooks. I never had that. Most of us never had that. Most of us were coming in going, I'm poking around on ACX and I'm going to find this, and I think I know what an audiobook is.
Mm-hmm.
And then going from there and sort of making every mistake along the way that you make. We all arrive there in different times, I think.
It's interesting too, because the timeline of when I started working with publishers also coincided with the pandemic. And so I, not like you guys, I had over 100 titles by the time I was working with my first publisher. So I felt perfectly comfortable with what I was doing. I felt lucky that producers had gotten comfortable with home records. So they said, here you go, do your thing. So for me, yeah, it wasn't much of a thing at that point, but I think it probably would have been if it had been a couple years earlier, or I just wouldn't have gotten the work because I wasn't in town to go to a studio.
I had a very specific scenario where I had done 2 indie novels and a children's book. And then one of the people who worked on the second novel I'd done said, do you have a website? I didn't. I put up that website, and then otherwise my email address wasn't available publicly. I put up that website, and then the next day I got my first publisher offer, which was the co-narrated book I did with Mark that we mentioned earlier. That was the pilot episode. And there wasn't, it was terrifying because I was like, I don't think there was any point at which I considered not taking it. And it was like, I didn't know how to do this. At that point, I was still recording in my open room with like no blanket walls or anything. But the book, I've listened back to it, I loved it. I think it came out lovely. I hurt my voice recording that book because I whispered most of it for the character. And similarly was still working full time and like scrunched the schedule in a way that I shouldn't have. And there were a ton of those pieces for me that I did feel underprepared, and I made it work, but did feel underprepared to kind of like you said, Lindsey, like work on that timeline or whatever it was. And it's interesting too, because I recently spoke with an indie narrator who makes his full-time work, really great full-time work from indie stuff, and is trying to connect more with publishers. And I was kind of like, what's your why? Like, what's your why for connecting with publishers? Because if you can make a great full-time work and you're even doing projects that have like really high visibility, what's your why? Mm-hmm. And realizing that like when producers talk about like what their goals are, a big part of their goal is making the author happy. Producers at big 5 companies. And indie narrators who are consistently putting away books have gotten very good at making indie authors happy. And I think that if you are ready, if you have all the things you need to put away a book, and like Lindsey said, you can shuffle in the context of their timeline, you can do all those things. I think there's, and someone's willing to cast you on a book, right? I think it's one of those like, make or break moments. You do what you do. That doesn't necessarily answer the question of like, when should I reach out? Like, when will I be ready? And the answer is that I don't know. Some people will do their very first book with Penguin. Like the folks here demonstrated, they might do 100 indie books and the first publisher book might be nothing. And it's going to be whatever it is the moment it is. And maybe that's being in conversation with a publisher and being like, hey, are you, here's a sample. Like, do you think I should do another book before I reach out again? Or like, whatever it is, I think people find their thing. Okay. We've got someone we're going to bring up onto the stage. So we're going to do all the little digital things. So we are going to bring up Alex Knox to the stage.
Thank you for having me. I am so I'm so thrilled to talk to y'all, and I just want to say thank you. From the first episodes of this podcast, I've had so many moments feeling like I knew y'all already. In fact, even learning that a couple of, I think Kirt and Lindsey went to the 2019 APAC, the new narrators. I was there too. It was my first APAC. It was like, we got in at the same time. And I just feel like I have such a cool parallel journey in a lot of ways to you guys. And you've made me feel for the first time really like a part of a community. I mean, I'm part of the union. I've got some really close buddies who we check in and support each other, but you've opened up this narrator world in an amazing way where I now feel like, oh no, I can be a good mentor and I'm in my 3rd time doing the mentorship program with APA, and I'm like, now I'm getting the hang of it. And so I thank you so much. Please keep doing this, and thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, truly. Oh my God. Not just like I know like the PBS like thank you for watching or whatever, but like I feel like it's been really fascinating being able to hear stories like yours, Alex, because these are also like everyday colleagues. Like, Alex and I, we got to meet kind of over the past couple of months at APAC the Audis recently. And the reality of, I think, what we keep hitting at in all of these conversations, like the conversation with Daniela, and like you have to say the thing in order for anyone to know that it's a reality. You have to actually be in communication with people about your experiences. The conversation with Jillian about like communicating your truth, like getting out the word that of who you are, of what you want. With Eunice about like even identifying, I guess, in the text, like these moments of creating honesty, of being things that you want to be, or the conversation with Helen, like all of these pieces about like being in community and communication feel like they keep coming up across all our conversations. And it feels really great to see, I think, those things actually come to life for someone. There was a moment after we released Daniela's episode that a small producer, I think of romance books, reached out to us on our Instagram account and said, this conversation was really impactful. We're going to go right now and write a co-narration policy and start sharing that with our narrators. And that I think there has to be like, we have to, what's the Daniela quote? Like, we have to complain, but also we have to share joy. We have to share like these things that excite us. So I appreciate you, Alex, for sharing that joy, for like being in conversation about this, for being engaged on our Instagram. But thank you so much for coming up and joining us.
And it's always great to make a new friend, because, you know, these relationships that we form online are like, for somebody like me who's living in the Midwest, like, this is how I make my work friends, which, you know, is so important.
Yes.
I want to share two quick announcements, and then we'll wrap up. I'm going to read our little outro. Announcement number 1. This is just an encouragement. Y'all heard throughout the course of this episode, I think this is, of course, going to be the episode we've had the most punch-ins so far. But punch-ins are just audience questions, and we want to hear more from y'all. We want to hear kind of what you're curious about. Throw out ideas, because sometimes they'll align with things we're already planning, but sometimes we've had punch-ins that like inspire an entire episode. So don't forget, you can drop by our website to submit those at any time. We would love to hear from you, and you will hear that message again shortly in our outro. The other piece that I wanted to say, we did a fantastic run, 13 hours, 10 episodes, 5 minisodes. And so we're going to take a break. We've been releasing episodes every week, essentially since January. We're going to go rest a little bit, go record, go take long walks for our mental health. And I'm super excited. The team has, we've heard from the producers. We've heard from the studio over at Fox. Why would I say that? Why would I put us on? Oh my God. I'm so sorry. We've heard from the studios.
You know, the shadowy cabal of people in suits.
the demons I see in the corner when I can't wait. No. We've heard from the studios that Narrator Roundtable shall return for another run of 10 episodes. I'm super excited for it. We're looking forward to coming back in the fall of 2024. We've already got episodes scheduled for interviews. We're bringing people on. It's so exciting, and it's looking great. And many of those people might be you. It was very intentional that we made a post on Instagram where we were like, what would you talk about if you came on the Narrator Roundtable? So if you have ideas, like I said, drop us any ideas on our website for a punch-in, because we want to keep having these conversations as long as there's good conversation to be had, and there is still plenty of good conversation to be had. With that being said, thank you so much to our audience today. Thank you so much to Mark Sanderlin for coming back, joining us on the pod today. Thank you for joining us at the Narrator Roundtable. If you want to join the conversation, find us on social media or visit our website, narratorroundtable.com, to submit a question or a topic of discussion for a future episode. What's on your mind? We want to talk about it.
The Narrator Roundtable is produced and hosted by André Santana, Deanna Anthony, Gail Shalan, Kirt and Lindsey Dorcus. All copywritten material is shared with permission. Music and sound effects are licensed through Storyblocks Audio. All opinions shared are those of the individuals and do not reflect the positions or policies of any company or organization with which they happen to be associated.